The suffocating June of 1834 descended upon Georgia's Atlantic coast with a heat so intense it seemed to blur the boundaries between earth and sky. The air shimmering above the sea island cotton fields and salt marshes that stretched for miles along the waterways connecting Savannah to the barrier islands, creating conditions that made sustained labor feel like a form of slow death, and that demonstrated with brutal clarity why this region had earned its reputation as one of the most deadly environments for enslaved people anywhere in the American South. In the slave quarters of Palmetto Sound Plantation, situated on one of the coastal islands where the Savannah River met the Atlantic Ocean, and where isolation created its own particular forms of brutality and control, field workers gathered in the evening darkness when temperatures finally dropped to merely unbearable levels, and spoke in voices that carried both the deep skepticism born from years of bitter experience and something that might have been the most tentative whisper of cautious possibility about an extraordinary purchase that had been completed 4 weeks earlier at the Savannah slave market. According to local legend, what had transpired that May morning defied every pattern they had observed across decades of watching how Georgia's coastal planter elite made decisions about acquiring the human property that sustained their sea island cotton operations, suggesting possibilities that seemed too improbable to trust, yet too detailed and too consistently reported across multiple witnesses to dismiss entirely as mere hopeful fantasy, constructed to make unbearable circumstances slightly more psychologically survivable through dreams of deliverance that harsh reality would inevitably destroy. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 14 months would become a story whispered not merely as another tale of suffering endured, but as compelling evidence that even within Georgia's Sea Island region, where slavery existed in particularly brutal and isolated form, where barrier island geography created natural prisons that made escape extraordinarily difficult, and where the combination of malarial swamps, treacherous waterways, and comprehensive surveillance made successful flight seem nearly impossible. Unexpected alliances could nevertheless form between people whom every social convention and legal structure insisted must remain forever separated by unbridgeable divisions, creating possibilities for resistance and liberation that demonstrated slavery's fundamental vulnerability when moral conviction combined with strategic intelligence, geographic knowledge, and the kind of sustained courage that understood both the enormous risks involved in such defiance and the even greater moral costs of remaining passively complicit in a system whose brutality became more undeniable with every day of proximity to its deadly operations. Georgia's Atlantic coast in the mid-1830s represented a distinctive manifestation of American slavery, a region where Sea Island cotton cultivation had created extraordinary wealth for planter families who owned the barrier islands and the enslaved people who worked them, where geographic isolation combined with disease environments to create conditions that killed workers at rates that required constant replacement through the domestic slave trade, and where the peculiar task system of labor organization created small spaces of autonomy for enslaved people, even as the broader structures of control remained absolutely comprehensive and backed by violence that was all the more terrifying for being exercised in locations where geographic isolation meant that brutality could occur far from any external witnesses who might provide even the minimal restraint that public visibility sometimes imposed. Savannah had become the commercial center for this coastal slavery, a city that combined elegant townhouses and refined social pretensions with slave markets that operated with systematic brutality, processing thousands of people annually in transactions that sustained both the city's economy and the Sea Island plantations, whose profits financed the construction of the architectural grandeur that visitors admired while carefully averting their eyes from the human commerce that made such magnificence materially possible. The market in Savannah functioned with rituals refined across generations to transform human beings into commercial property, with auctioneers cataloging physical capabilities and estimated years of productive labor in language that treated conscious beings as agricultural equipment, whose value could be calculated through formulas that made no acknowledgement whatsoever of the suffering and humanity of those being bought and sold in transactions that generated enormous revenues for traders who had perfected the art of extracting maximum profit from systematic dehumanization. The legal structures governing Georgia slavery in 1834 were comprehensive and harsh, reflecting both the state's history as one of the original colonies where slavery had been initially prohibited, but then embraced with particular enthusiasm once economic interests overwhelmed early moral objections, and the coastal region's particular anxieties about controlling large enslaved populations in isolated locations where the ratio of black to white residents created persistent fears about potential uprisings that demanded systematic mechanisms of control, backed by both legal authority and organized violence. The slave code forbade enslaved people from learning to read under penalty of severe physical punishment, prohibited gathering without white supervision, restricted movement so thoroughly that even travel between different parts of the same plantation required passes that patrols could demand at any moment, and created comprehensive frameworks of control that attempted to make resistance both legally impossible and practically futile, regardless of how desperately people might long for freedom, or how intelligently they might search for vulnerabilities in systems that claimed absolute authority. Free black people existed in Savannah and occasionally in coastal areas, but under restrictions so severe that their status remained perpetually precarious and subject to challenge, requiring constant documentation and white patronage to avoid re-enslavement through legal mechanisms that Georgia had deliberately constructed to make even legally free people vulnerable to being claimed as property if they could not produce absolutely ironclad proof of their status at any moment when challenged. Into this world of barrier island isolation and systematic brutality, of comprehensive legal controls backed by violence that occurred far from potential witnesses, of extraordinary wealth built upon suffering and death that planters concealed behind facades of cultivated gentility and paternalistic claims about supposedly humane treatment, came two people whose encounter would reveal that even apparently harmonious marriages within Georgia's coastal planter aristocracy could conceal profound disagreements about the fundamental morality of the system that sustained their households, and that such disagreements could manifest in actions that violated every expectation about how white women from Sea Island planter families were supposed to relate to the enslaved people whose labor and suffering made their privileged existence materially possible. Stories passed down through generations claim that the May morning in 1834, when James and Abigail Winthrop attended the Savannah slave market, began with a conversation that had been occurring with mounting frequency and increasing emotional intensity over recent months. A discussion about Palmetto Sound's labor requirements and the decisions that the previous year's combination of yellow fever outbreak and hurricane damage seemed to require if the plantation was to maintain its Sea Island cotton production at levels that would sustain the family's accustomed standard of living and their position within Savannah's coastal planter elite. James had concluded that the estate's operations demanded purchasing several replacement workers to compensate for the 12 people who had died during the previous summer's particularly devastating yellow fever epidemic, and to provide additional hands for repairing the extensive damage that fall's hurricane had inflicted on the plantation's buildings and infrastructure. Acquisitions that would require substantial capital expenditure, but that he considered absolutely necessary if Palmetto Sound was to maintain its position as one of the region's more productive Sea Island cotton operations. He had come to Savannah that morning intending to purchase young workers who could provide years of productive labor before the brutal conditions destroyed them, as they inevitably would. Making calculations about expected years of service and productive capacity that treated human beings as equipment with predictable depreciation schedules that could be factored into economic planning just like any other capital investment in tools or machinery. But Abigail had accompanied him to Savannah despite his suggestion that she remain at their island estate, ostensibly to attend to some shopping and social calls while he conducted his business at the slave market. And her presence would transform the day's events in ways that neither could have anticipated, and that would permanently alter both their marriage and their relationship to the institution that had sustained both their families across multiple generations since the earliest days of Georgia's colonial history. According to oral histories preserved with remarkable consistency across generations among the networks that assisted fugitives and among enslaved communities that maintained careful unofficial records of events that official documentation systematically excluded, the morning's transactions proceeded according to James's plans through the initial stages, with him successfully purchasing 3 field workers, people in their late teens and early 20s whose physical condition suggested they might survive the Sea Island environment for perhaps 5 to 8 years if they possessed unusual constitution, and if yellow fever and malaria and the countless other hazards of coastal plantation life didn't kill them prematurely, as such conditions killed so many others with terrifying regularity. But when the auctioneer brought a man named Econ to the block, 7 feet and 7 inches tall, with a physique suggesting tremendous physical strength combined with a bearing that even the degrading rituals of the market couldn't fully suppress, described by the auctioneer as someone who had been sold 3 times in 4 years because previous owners found him resistant to proper discipline, despite his obvious capacity for the heaviest labor that Sea Island cotton cultivation required. Something shifted fundamentally in the dynamic between James and Abigail. That would alter not just that day's transactions, but the entire trajectory of their lives together, and their relationship to the system of human bondage that had sustained their family's wealth and social position for as long as either could remember. Abigail had watched the morning's earlier purchases with a discomfort that James had noticed, but attributed to feminine sensibility about the market's brutal atmosphere. Though he had also felt some irritation that she had insisted on remaining in Savannah, rather than returning to their island estate as he had suggested. Exposing herself unnecessarily to scenes that he recognized were unpleasant, even as he considered them economically unavoidable and morally justifiable through the elaborate rationalizations about paternalistic care and racial hierarchy that Georgia's planter class had developed to defend an institution whose brutality they worked assiduously to conceal behind carefully constructed public facades of refinement and supposedly humane treatment. But when she saw Econ standing on that platform, when she heard the auctioneer's descriptions that barely concealed histories of brutal treatment behind carefully chosen euphemisms about management difficulties and resistance to proper subordination, when she observed the intelligence and unbroken dignity in his bearing despite the degrading circumstances and the visible scars that testified to repeated attempts to break his spirit through violence that had clearly failed to achieve the total submission that slavery demanded. Abigail made a decision that years of apparently harmonious marriage within one of the Sea Island region's most established and respected planter families had given no indication whatsoever that she possessed the capacity or the courage to make. She turned to James and told him in a voice that carried an authority he had never once heard from her regarding any matter related to plantation operations or the management of enslaved workers that they would purchase this man. That regardless of whatever other acquisitions he intended to make that day to address Palmetto Sound's labor requirements, this particular purchase was one she was insisting upon with an intensity and conviction that communicated her demand was absolutely non-negotiable, and that she would not accept any argument or explanation he might offer for refusing to comply with what she was requesting. James's response combined profound shock at what he perceived as his wife's unprecedented and utterly incomprehensible interference in decisions that were properly and exclusively his domain as master of Palmetto Sound, mounting anger at what seemed like deliberate and inexplicable undermining of the careful economic calculations he had made about the plantation's specific labor requirements and operational needs, and genuine bewilderment about what she could possibly hope to accomplish by insisting on purchasing someone whose documented history of sales suggested he would create exactly the kind of management problems and discipline challenges that efficient Sea Island cotton operations absolutely could not tolerate if they were to maintain the productivity levels that sustained the extraordinary profits these plantations generated. He told her that the suggestion made absolutely no economic sense whatsoever, that Sea Island cotton cultivation required workers who would submit completely to the brutal discipline and exhausting labor that productivity demanded, that purchasing someone explicitly described as resistant to proper authority would create serious operational problems that would require either selling him quickly at a substantial financial loss or subjecting him to escalating violence that might ultimately destroy expensive property without ever achieving the total subordination that made such investments economically worthwhile and operationally manageable. But Abigail's insistence was unyielding and absolute, in ways that transcended mere disagreement about plantation management, to communicate that she was acting on convictions she considered more fundamental than his authority as her husband and master of their estate. More important than their economic interests or the social expectations that normally governed her behavior, and more essential than even the stability of their marriage that such open and public defiance of his judgment might permanently and irreparably damage. She told him that if he absolutely refused to bid on this man, despite her explicit request, she would find ways to use inheritance from her family that Georgia law gave her limited but real control over to make the purchase independently, and to arrange for his transport to Palmetto Sound regardless of James's objections. That this was a line she was drawing about what she would tolerate happening in her name and with her implicit complicity. She made clear that she recognized the economic irrationality of her demand and fully understood the management complications it would likely create, but that there were moral considerations that she could no longer ignore or suppress regardless of the personal and social consequences that adherence to conscience might create for both of them. Faced with what amounted to an ultimatum delivered in tones that suggested profound conviction rather than temporary emotional excess or feminine sentiment, and acutely aware that other Sea Island planters and Savannah merchants were observing this unprecedented and deeply scandalous public disagreement between husband and wife over matters that every social convention and legal principle decreed belonged exclusively and unquestionably to male authority. James bid on Econ with mounting resentment and barely suppressed fury, but also with a kind of wary and deeply uncomfortable recognition that his wife of 19 years was revealing aspects of her character and convictions that their marriage had somehow never fully exposed or brought into view, despite nearly 2 decades of daily proximity, and what he had believed was genuine intimacy and complete mutual understanding. He competed against 2 other bidders who recognized Econ's potential value for the heaviest plantation labor, despite the documented concerns about his supposed unsuitability for proper subordination, and he finally secured him for $1,900. A very substantial sum for someone whose history of multiple sales within just 4 years suggested he would almost certainly prove commercially problematic and operationally difficult to manage according to the standards that efficient Sea Island plantations required. As they completed the purchase and arranged for Econ to be transported by boat to Palmetto Sound, along with the other workers James had acquired that morning, James demanded explanations for behavior he found both utterly incomprehensible and profoundly threatening to his understanding of how their household functioned and how his authority over plantation matters was supposed to operate without challenge or interference from his wife, regardless of whatever personal feelings or moral qualms she might privately harbor about specific decisions he made in his capacity as master of their estate. But Abigail steadfastly declined to provide details or explanations that would satisfy his increasingly urgent and increasingly angry questions, speaking instead about moral obligations and Christian duties and divine judgment against oppression in language so deliberately general and so carefully vague that it seemed explicitly calculated to avoid revealing whatever specific purposes motivated her unprecedented insistence, while nevertheless making absolutely clear that those purposes reflected convictions she considered completely non-negotiable, regardless of the consequences such stubborn adherence to principle might create for their marriage, their social standing, or their relationship to the institution that sustained everything they possessed. What James did not know, what Abigail's extraordinarily careful and disciplined discretion across many years had successfully concealed from him despite the intimate daily proximity that marriage and household management necessarily created, was that his wife had been conducting a quiet but increasingly comprehensive and systematic campaign of resistance against slaveries. Brutalities that manifested in ways he never noticed or recognized because he simply assumed her household management decisions and her interactions with enslaved workers reflected the same conventional economic calculations and paternalistic assumptions that governed his own thinking rather than moral convictions that would have alarmed him profoundly and perhaps even genuinely terrified him had he understood their true nature and increasingly radical extent and implications. Abigail had grown up in a Savannah family whose Methodist faith emphasized themes of divine justice and human accountability, and universal salvation in ways that created profound internal tensions and contradictions with slaveholding that some particularly sensitive individuals found increasingly difficult to maintain or rationalize through the elaborate theological gymnastics that most slaveholding Christians performed to reconcile their professed faith with their daily participation in systematic human bondage. And she had inherited from her mother a deep conviction that slavery fundamentally violated Christian principles about human equality before God and divine judgment against oppression, even as social realities and economic dependencies and family pressures made open opposition seem absolutely impossible for families whose entire material existence and social position depended completely on the institution, and whose rejection of slavery would mean not just economic ruin, but total social ostracism and permanent exile from the only world they had ever known. When she married James and became mistress of Palmetto Sound, Abigail had initially hoped and believed that she might be able to influence him gradually toward more humane treatment of enslaved workers. That daily proximity and her gentle persuasion and moral example might slowly soften whatever abstract justifications and convenient rationalizations allowed him to maintain the system with apparent moral comfort and psychological ease, despite the obvious suffering it created for people whose fundamental humanity was undeniable to anyone genuinely willing to see and acknowledge it. But she had gradually and painfully recognized that James's commitment to slavery transcended simple economic interest or social convention to reflect deeply internalized beliefs about racial hierarchy and the supposed naturalness of black servitude that made him genuinely and perhaps permanently unable to see enslaved people as fully human in morally significant ways. That his entire sense of social order and his understanding of history and his family's place in Georgia's development depended upon accepting slavery as both economically necessary and fundamentally morally legitimate, despite whatever regrettable excesses individual cruel masters might occasionally commit. This painful and disillusioning recognition had led Abigail to begin taking covert actions she could never acknowledge to her husband or to anyone else in their social circle. Using her authority over household operations and her relationships with enslaved women who worked in close daily proximity to her to create small spaces of relative safety and limited autonomy that mitigated slavery's worst effects and provided some measure of protection without directly challenging James's ultimate control over plantation operations or openly defying the legal and social structures that sustained the entire system. She taught household servants to read, despite laws explicitly forbidding literacy, and despite the severe punishments that both teacher and students would face if their activities were discovered by authorities or reported by informers. She maintained extraordinarily careful contacts with the small and extremely cautious network of Quakers and other anti-slavery sympathizers who operated clandestinely in Savannah and in scattered locations along the coast. People who took truly extraordinary personal risks to assist those seeking freedom, despite the comprehensive legal apparatus and organized violence that Georgia had constructed specifically to prevent exactly what these networks were attempting to facilitate. Most significantly and most dangerously, Abigail had been systematically learning about escape routes and studying the networks that helped fugitives navigate the extraordinarily difficult journey from Georgia's coastal islands toward free territory, despite enormous geographic obstacles and comprehensive surveillance, accumulating detailed knowledge and developing reliable contacts that she had no immediate plan to use, but that she recognized might prove absolutely crucial if circumstances ever created opportunities to help someone reach freedom. When she saw Econ on that auction block in Savannah, when she heard the auctioneer's descriptions of his repeated resistance to total subordination across multiple ownerships, when she observed the unbroken intelligence and dignity in his bearing despite the visible scars and the degrading circumstances, Abigail recognized someone who was clearly marked for eventual destruction through either escalating violence that would eventually kill him, or through sale to even worse conditions in the deep South interior, where cotton or sugar production would destroy him within years, if not months. In that moment of recognition, Abigail made a decision she had been unconsciously moving toward for years, without ever quite fully acknowledging to herself the radical implications and enormous dangers of what she was contemplating. That she would use whatever resources and influence her position as mistress of one of the Sea Islands' established estates provided to help this man not just survive the immediate threat of sale to worse circumstances, but to actually escape to freedom. Regardless of the profound risks such assistance would create for her own security and social standing, and regardless of how her husband would react if he ever discovered the truth about what she was actually doing behind the carefully maintained facade of dutiful plantation mistress that she had performed so convincingly across nearly 2 decades of marriage. Akon arrived at Palmetto Sound on a June evening when the heat and humidity had reached levels that made even minimal physical exertion genuinely dangerous and potentially fatal, and when the plantation's rhythms were governed entirely by the brutal demands of Sea Island cotton cultivation that continued relentlessly, regardless of temperatures and conditions that killed the unprepared and the unlucky with terrifying regularity. James assigned Econ immediately to the hardest and most unpleasant work available during the growing season, clearing new ground for cotton planting while working in standing water under direct sun that could cause heat stroke within hours, moving massive timbers through swamps where every step risked injury from hidden obstacles or attack from venomous snakes, performing backbreaking labor that was explicitly designed to break spirits and establish absolute subordination through exhaustion and suffering that would make resistance seem utterly futile. But what James did not observe or recognize, what the plantation's daily routines and the geographic isolation of Barrier Island life made essentially invisible to him as he focused his attention on managing cotton production and maintaining the surveillance systems that island geography already made more comprehensive than mainland operations required, was that Abigail began finding ways to communicate with Econ that appeared entirely routine and completely appropriate from any external observation, but that actually served purposes her husband would have found both utterly incomprehensible and absolutely intolerable had he understood what was actually occurring. She would arrange to bring additional food and water to field workers during the hottest and most dangerous hours of the day, a practice that James viewed as prudent concern for maintaining valuable property in working condition. But that gave Abigail brief opportunities to speak with Econ in contexts where conversations could plausibly be disguised as simple instructions about household tasks or inquiries about his physical condition and adjustment to the plantation's routines and the island's brutal environment. She assigned him to perform occasional maintenance work on structures and equipment closer to the main residence. Labor that his extraordinary strength obviously suited him for, but that also created opportunities for slightly longer exchanges to occur without attracting undue attention from overseers or other enslaved workers who might feel obligated to report any unusual interactions between the mistress and a field worker, who should have no legitimate reason for extended contact with household operations. Most crucially and most dangerously, Abigail ensured that Econ received responsibilities that occasionally required him to travel by boat to Savannah or to other islands to collect supplies or deliver items for the plantation. Journeys that James viewed as efficient use of someone whose size and strength made him capable of handling heavy cargo and managing boats in challenging tidal waters. But that actually served Abigail's carefully concealed purposes by giving Econ invaluable direct knowledge of the waterways and coastal navigation and contacts in Savannah that could prove absolutely essential if escape ever became possible. Through these extraordinarily carefully orchestrated interactions conducted over many months with remarkable discipline and security consciousness, Abigail communicated information that Econ received with the profound wariness and deep skepticism that years of bitter experience had taught him was absolutely essential when dealing with any white person's promises or offers of assistance, regardless of how sincere they might appear. She told him that she opposed slavery on fundamental moral grounds despite her position as mistress of one of the Sea Island's established estates, that she maintained carefully protected contacts through Methodist and Quaker networks, who could provide assistance to those seeking freedom, despite the severe legal penalties and social consequences such activities invited if discovered, that she would help him escape when circumstances made such assistance feasible without creating immediate suspicions that would endanger everyone involved in the attempt. Econ listened to these communications while maintaining the kind of careful skepticism and cautious distrust that survival had taught him was essential. Understanding that some slaveholders deliberately used false offers of assistance to identify those contemplating resistance so that brutal public examples could be made that would discourage others from harboring similar thoughts. But he also recognized that his circumstances on this isolated barrier island might never again provide opportunities like those Abigail seemed to be offering, and that refusing potential assistance simply because it seemed improbable, or because trust seemed impossibly risky, might itself be a form of excessive caution that kept people enslaved when freedom could be achieved through calculated risk-taking. The late summer and fall of 1834 brought a period of extraordinarily careful mutual assessment and gradual trust-building, during which Abigail worked systematically to demonstrate to Econ that her assistance was genuine and that her commitment to helping him escape reflected authentic moral conviction rather than some elaborate deception. While Econ simultaneously tested the authenticity of her claims through small acts of resistance and requests for assistance that could reveal whether she would report him to James, or whether her opposition to slavery was substantial enough to withstand the pressures and dangers that actually facilitating escape would necessarily involve. Abigail began providing increasingly specific and detailed information about routes along the coast toward northern states, explaining with remarkable precision the locations of free Black communities in Charleston and further north who might offer assistance despite enormous risks, sharing knowledge about coastal patrol patterns and surveillance that could help avoid detection during the dangerous early stages of flight. She gave him access to maps and maritime navigation materials that helped him understand the complex geography and challenging waterways between Georgia's Sea Islands and Free Territory. Resources her education allowed her to possess, but that would mean severe punishment for any enslaved person discovered with them. Most significantly, Abigail systematically accumulated concrete resources necessary for escape, preserved food for extended water travel, clothing suitable for varied conditions, and most crucially, forged papers identifying Econ as a free Black waterman named Elijah Cooper, traveling on legitimate maritime business. Documents she obtained through Savannah contacts who took extraordinary risks. Econ, observing these preparations while continuing to test her sincerity, gradually came to believe her assistance was authentic and represented genuine possibilities despite formidable obstacles. By spring of 1835, preparations that Abigail and Econ had maintained for nearly a year moved toward implementation as circumstances created opportunity. James needed to travel to Milledgeville for extended legislative sessions and business with cotton factors. Commitments that would keep him away from Palmetto Sound for at least 4 weeks and leave Abigail in practical control of plantation operations with minimal oversight. She communicated through established methods that Econ should prepare to attempt escape during this window, that she would create conditions necessary for departure, but timing would depend on variables including weather and tides that they couldn't completely predict. The plan involved Econ leaving on what would appear a routine boat journey to Savannah to collect supplies, a task he had performed multiple times. But instead of returning to Palmetto Sound, he would continue north along the coast using waterways, carrying forged papers and money Abigail provided, relying on networks she had connected him to for assistance at critical points along the extraordinarily dangerous journey. The opportunity came in April 1835, during the 3rd week after James's departure, when weather and tides aligned favorably for extended coastal travel before summer storms made such passage suicidal. Abigail sent Econ to Savannah with supplies to purchase and a boat ostensibly needed to transport materials back. But she also provided forged papers identifying him as Elijah Cooper, substantial money for weeks of travel, and detailed instructions about contacts in Savannah and at intervals along the coast who could provide further assistance toward eventual passage into free states. Their final conversation, preserved in oral traditions maintained by those who assisted his flight, acknowledged both his gratitude for assistance he had never imagined receiving from someone in her position and recognition that she was taking extraordinary risks that could destroy her entire life if discovered. Econ left Palmetto Sound on an April morning when spring tides and favorable winds created ideal conditions for the kind of coastal navigation his escape would require. He traveled to Savannah as instructed, made purchases establishing legitimate business appearance, then quietly met with contacts Abigail had arranged who provided additional resources and detailed guidance before he began his extraordinarily dangerous journey north along the coast, using forged papers and maritime skills gained from plantation work to navigate treacherous waterways. The journey from Georgia's Sea Islands to free territory required weeks of careful travel through coastal waters, where slave patrols operated, and where any black person without ironclad documentation faced immediate arrest. According to accounts preserved by networks that assisted fugitives, Econ successfully navigated these challenges through combination of Abigail's meticulous preparation, his own intelligence and maritime knowledge, and assistance from dozens who took enormous risks. By June 1835, Econ had reached Philadelphia and was establishing himself as Elijah Cooper, finding work in maritime trades and building life in freedom while maintaining the careful discretion that survival required. What happened in subsequent years remains largely undocumented, though some accounts suggest he eventually went to Canada for greater security. Back at Palmetto Sound, Abigail managed aftermath with carefully prepared performance, expressing surprise when Econ failed to return from Savannah and suggesting explanations ranging from drowning to simple flight. When James returned to discover the acquisition his wife had insisted upon had vanished, his anger combined financial loss, bewilderment about her original insistence, and discomfort that his absence had enabled escape. He organized searches and offered rewards, contacted slave catchers, and placed advertisements. But the trail had gone cold completely. Whether James ever suspected Abigail's role remains uncertain, if doubts emerged. He never voiced them publicly, perhaps because accusation would require acknowledging possibilities that would fundamentally destabilize their marriage. Abigail maintained careful discretion for the remainder of her life. Understanding revelation could endanger both herself and others in networks that continued assisting fugitives. The financial loss combined with other pressures eventually forced adjustments to Palmetto Sound's operations. The impact rippled through enslaved communities in ways official records never captured, but oral traditions preserved as evidence that freedom remained achievable even from the Sea Islands' isolated and brutal slavery. For enslaved people throughout coastal Georgia, the story became proof that careful planning with unexpected assistance could overcome even the most comprehensive surveillance. And sometimes, according to legends communities preserved, that resistance stood 7 feet 7 inches tall, purchased at a wife's insistence not to be exploited but to be saved. assisted by a planter's wife whose moral convictions led her to violate every expectation and whose strategic courage created possibilities the system insisted could never exist. Econ's journey from Savannah's auction block to Philadelphia freedom lasted barely 11 months. But his story became enduring proof that freedom was achievable through intelligence and courage and unexpected alliance. That moral conviction could lead people to risk everything to help others escape bondage, and that human dignity could never be completely suppressed regardless of how brutal or comprehensive the apparatus of oppression.